The paper I read for this week is called The Behavioral Implications of Big Data's Impact on Audit Judgment and Decision Making and Future Research Directions. So basically, this paper talk about the current situation of the application of big data in the audit environment and some limitations in during this application and also some future research directions. And this paper is written by three authors. Two of them are the professor of our department, and the other one is a professor of other university.
Unknown caller. Danielle graduated here maybe 7 years ago, 6 years ago. She got tenure this year in her university.
Oh, so all
Was
the
a,
others are AIS
was
people.
an accounting PhD student. I worked with her a little bit. She's great.
Okay. So first, let me
She
talk
had
about
two. She had two babies while getting her PhD.
yeah. So first, let me talk about the introduction part. As we all know that nowadays everything can create data, like your mobile phone, your car, your computer, and due to the development of various information system and the decreasing cost of the data storage, data are collected at an exponentially increasing rate. And such amount of data there is a term for it called big data. And actually, the collection of big data for nowadays is relatively easy. As Professor Miklos mentioned last time, there are many data repositories and websites nowadays where we can utilize like Python or R to automatically collect data. But the processing and extracting useful information from this data are still challenging, especially for the audit environment. So why? Let's look at the audit process. We can find that audit process involves judgments related to the type and amount of evidence collected. So this requires that the information used by audit should be relevant and trustworthy. And due to the nature of big data, most of the data we collected are unstructured data. So we cannot provide a 100% accuracy during the conversion of the unstructured data. So that is a very big challenge. And um, to deal with these difficulties, we have to understand the behavioral process that auditors engage in to process information to make future decisions. So the author of this paper still said that big data has the potential to change the way auditors make decisions. And the paper also identify the information process weaknesses and limitations to help the future research. Then let's look at the big data in the audit context. We have to say that the big data technology has improved the quality of the data, because previously we have to manually collect data. The accuracy must be low, but nowadays we use computer. The quality increased, and I remember there are some features for big data like high volume, high velocity, and high variety. So because of this, the high quality and the diversity that the information has increased, the big data has improved the efficiency and effectiveness of the audit engagement. For example, nowadays we can use big data to uncover patterns under potential high-risk transactions. There is a term called split payment. If we just manually check these payments, we cannot find some euro patterns. But if we use big data techniques, we can find them. But however, there are some significant problems posed by using big data in audit process. The first one is uh, actually auditors are not accustomed to extract information from a large population of data from non-financial sources. Traditionally, auditors will use some classic data analysis tools like computer-assisted audit techniques, CAATs. This kind of tool can do some basic data analysis, but they cannot deal with the non-financial data. So the auditors have to manually detect the anomalies from the database. And secondly, the use of big data limits analysis to correlations through looking for patterns that might help predict future occurrences. This means that big data will lead the auditors to find out the correlations between the problem and the causation. But find correlation is meaningless because correlation alone do not provide sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. So we have to focus on the causation because causation is a critical and necessary aspect of auditing. And thirdly, because of the unstructured nature of big data, like emails, company blogs, um, this kind of big data can potentially result in the difficulty of choosing relevant data. I will talk about relevant data in the next few slides. Then let's look at the behavioral implications. In this part, we basically talk about some limitations that auditors will encounter when they process information. The big data techniques and softwares and algorithms has the potential to improve the auditor judgment and decision, and that is correct. We can we can prove that through the evolution of data analysis tools. For example, previously people use CAATs, but nowadays they use more advanced data analytic techniques like clustering, which to find the similarities among a group of data, and the neural networks. So these kind of techniques can be used on the unstructured data. So, but we still find some limitations during the application of big data techniques. We find that decisions made based on information derived from big data still involve interpretation and judgment. What does it mean? Let's look at an example. The modern data analytics tools can give us a pattern behind a group of data, but it's up to the auditors to judge whether the pattern is correct, and also it's up to the auditors to interpret the pattern. So before we fully utilize the big data, we have to process the weaknesses and cognitive limitations. The first limitation here is called information overload, which means receiving too much information at a time. Auditors are human beings, so we cannot use our limited ability to process large amounts of information. For example, the data analytic tools can bring us overwhelming amount of data, but it is very hard to do analysis and interpretation over this huge amount of data. So this limitation will lead to a suboptimal financial and auditing judgment. However, there are some possible approaches to deal with this limitation. For example, the decision makers can select a model that is suitable for the particular decision, which to mitigate the information processing difficulties. Actually, this kind of approach has been utilized in like insurance and medical industries for many years. For example, the insurance company will use this kind of model to detect the fraudulent claims among their customers. And if we look at the audit environment, ESA also proposed a weighted rule-based system in 2013. And this system is to first identifies exceptions, which means the cases that violate the business rules. Cases violate the business rules are called exceptions. So first, the system identifies the exceptions, and then the system will utilize knowledge extracted from an expert or a senior auditors to prioritize and rank the exceptions. So this process is like a digital assistant that will help the auditor do some prior jobs. Let's look at the second limitation. It's called information relevance. Actually, this limitation is related to the first limitation. Because of the information overload, a huge amount of data make auditors very difficult to extract relevant information. And this process will directly reduce their overall decision-making performance. There is a term. This phenomena is also called dilution effect, which is easy to understand, which means that the irrelevant information will dilute the relevant information. Actually, this limitation is faced by many business industries because finding relevant information is very important for business operations, right? And if we look at the audit firms, this kind of problem, which is to identify relevant non-financial information, is particularly important because, as I just mentioned, audit relies on relevant and trustworthy information. And a huge amount of big data are non-financial information and unstructured information. So most of the data are ambiguous and voluminous. So this is a more serious problem for audit firms. There is still one approach proposed by Lombardi in 2012, and this paper states that they will let the less experienced auditors use an expert system in making a fraud risk assessment. And this process is to mitigate incorporation of irrelevant information in the decision process. And the third limitation is called pattern recognition. We have to say that big data provides the decision maker with the ability to search for patterns in a large population of data. For example, big data will make audits recognize the patterns in the data. One example is auditors can find the inconsistencies of the transactions. But prior researchers find that actually auditors are not adept at recognizing patterns for several reasons. Here I just listed two reasons. Firstly, auditors find it difficult to accurately extract time series data. And secondly, auditors tend to focus on incorrect cause of an error instead of the patterns of the data. But recent literature find that after some training, auditors can grab the techniques to successfully extract pattern from big data. And for example, with some contextual experience and training, the auditors can obtain the ability to accurately recognize and interpret patterns in data. Beside that, several data analytic tools like cluster analysis and association rules will also mitigate auditors' difficulties. The last limitation is called ambiguity. Ambiguity actually is caused by unstructured nature of the data that comes in many formats like text, image, and video. Actually, there are two kinds of people. One is ambiguity intolerant person and ambiguity tolerant person. For ambiguity intolerant individuals, they tend to find ways to reduce the uncertainty by focusing on the simple solutions to resolve apparent ambiguous situations. And they are more likely to prematurely end the decision process compared to ambiguity tolerant individuals. And lastly, these kind of people are not comfortable with the unstructured nature of big data, which means if an auditor is ambiguity intolerant person, he tend to not use unstructured big data. And for ambiguity tolerant person, they do not experience stress when information is vague, incomplete, unstructured, or unclear. But here are some ways to deal with this. There is a model called predictive analytics model, which is to identify meaningful patterns of data to forecast the unknown future events. There is an example from the insurance company. The insurance company often receive some ambiguous information about a patient, but the company still have to make some actionable information. Actually, this process is based on the predictive analytics. So in the audit environment, this model can be applied to ambiguous and highly subjective judgments, such as going concern, fraud, etc., to model relationships among various relevant factors. Then let's look at the discussion and conclusion part. This not very long paper address the current states of big data with regard to the audit environment. And the authors discuss selected information processing weaknesses and limitations. They also identify existing technologies that can be leveraged in an audit environment. The authors also suggest some promising research directions in the future. And lastly, the authors comment that overall, incorporating big data into the audit process is a value-added proposition for auditors, but this does not come without challenges. The final part is some remarks. After read this paper, I think this paper gives us a very thorough analysis of each limitations encountered by audit process. And during this process, the authors bring us a detailed literature summary and some comparison between audit industry and other industries like insurance and medical industry. And the authors also suggest auditors to learn from other industries. Actually, I believe this kind of illustration and analogy are great ways to give reader a better understanding of what the author are trying to express. So if I have the chance to work on this paper, I will provide more examples and analogies on what other industries are utilizing big data techniques and give suggestions on what current auditors can do. And that's all for my presentation. Thank you.